Hi, good day to you wherever you are, and thank you for clicking on this video. Today, we'll broadly be looking at the demonisation of black nightlife over the years in the UK. The idea from this video came from the fact that I've always been aware of this tendency to feel like it's a big old hassle going out as a black person in the UK, and I know that a lot of people feel the same. And where it's always been a thing, it's never really been this tangible topic, you know, it's quite frivolous, to be fair. But it indicates something else, and it's also a symptom of many other things. And so after a series of tweets that I've been seeing go somewhat viral, I might be exaggerating a little bit, over the last few weeks, I decided to look it up and see what was going on. So if you're interested, please watch the whole video, and I hope you enjoy it, and thanks. To start with, we need to go to the 20th century in Greater Manchester. Now, in Manchester, there's been a community of black people since at least the mid-1800s, but here we're going to be starting with the Second World War era and beyond. During the war, many servicemen and women came over from the Caribbean, and most of them chose to stay. Of the 11,000 stationed here, only about a third took up the offer of repatriation. Many of the ones who remained settled in Moss Side. 1948 was the year of the beginning of what we now refer to as the Windrush era, which was named after the HMT Empire Windrush, the ship that first embarked in 1948 from the Caribbean. Numbers didn't pick up in a big way from the region until about 1952, with the passing of the McCarran-Walter Act in the United States. Now, the United States passed this law in part to remedy the fact that up until that point, migration from East Asia was actually illegal. Prior to this, however, there were also colonial quotas. It was a kind of a legal loophole where all the different subjects from all the various colonial powers that were still around at that time could migrate into the United States fairly easily under these quotas. And with the passing of this act, it closed that loophole completely. So migration was essentially shut for Caribbeans into the United States. The whole topic in and of itself, so I've included my sources, please check it out in your own time. I think it's really interesting. By 1954, people from the Caribbean as a population had grown, and they were mainly based in English cities like Manchester, like London, like Liverpool, like Birmingham. And by 1961, 171,000 approximately people from the West Indies had settled in the UK. African and West Indian run nightclubs began appearing in the Salford area from as early as the late 1930s, with places such as the Palm Beach, which later became the Reno, the Merchant Navy, the Cotton Club and the Crew Club. Black people were effectively banned from other places, so these places were incredibly important for people who wanted to have a nice time out. So now we're in the Second World War era, and the Second World War of course had a huge impact on the area and the whole country in general. Now, with the arrival of Caribbean servicemen and women that I just mentioned earlier, you also had a large number of American GIs and other personnel come over during the war. In fact, 3 million were stationed in the UK throughout the war, and 135,000 of these were African American. So Europe's largest airfield was about 20 miles away from Manchester, and there were about 18,000 American servicemen and women stationed there. So naturally, Manchester became a magnet for them to hang out when they wanted to let loose and have a bit of a good time. It is here that I need to highlight the impact that American institutionalized segregation practiced in the United States armed forces had. Yes, some local white people did resist the imposition of American segregation in their establishments, but actually most establishments did become segregated anyway. Therefore, places like the Cotton Club became immensely popular with black Americans who could party till 8 o'clock in the morning with the local black patrons, sharing music and alcohol. However, segregation left a long-lasting impact in the area long after the Americans had left and long after the war was over. There were venues up and down the country that implemented a colour bar, which again continued to ban black people from entering. So Shebeens began to emerge in the 1950s in the area. So the word shebeen itself derives from Anglo-Irish and means an unlicensed establishment or probated house selling alcohol. Shebeens started in areas with significant Jamaican populations and were simple to set up, only requiring a room and the required musical equipment. In fact, an alternative name for a shebeen is a blues, named after the Blaupunkt, which was a popular radiogram at the time. Now, Moss Side, which I mentioned earlier, was a popular shebeen hotspot, with the use of abandoned hotels, dance halls, and even people's private residences. You had to pay to get in, and alcohol was sold for you to drink in or out of the place. A singer from the 50s scene describes places like Monton House, which remained popular well into the 70s, as somewhere to play cards, dice, shebeen as a verb, all sorts. They came to the Reno afterwards and then they all ended up in the Monton house. However, it was also now that the media began its long tradition of associating black nightlife with criminality and other immoral behaviours, going on that all sorts went on in them, when in fact, the only thing that was really going on that was illegal was the selling of unlicensed alcohol. I've talked a little bit about Shebeens' popularity, but other reasons include people feeling reminded of home where they were able to party freely and listen to their music without worrying about noise complaints. And it kind of provided a stark contrast to pub culture, which was seen as inhibitive and a little bit dull. It also gave an escape for the harsh realities of living in a racist, hostile, and foreign country. Shebeens also provided an alternative for established nightclubs like the Cotton Club and the Reno, especially for young black people. And as well as the sound system culture that Jamaicans had brought with them, you also had ska and calypso, which were popular all across the Caribbean. And then you had people listening to R&B, blues, jazz that had been made popular by the American GIs. This was an alternative to what was being played on the BBC and other radio stations at the time. The Nile nightclub even hosted the Eric Dean Orchestra in the 50s and 60s, which at times featured heavyweights from the West Indies and Africa, such as Fela Kuti and Lord Kitchener. It's really clear how key and how important culturally these spaces were for black people at the time and historically. So now we're going to move into the 1970s and we're going to look at a different part of the country. This time we're looking at Brixton, or Southview as its alias is referred to in Deborah Talbott's Regulating the Night, Race, Culture and Exclusion in the Making of the Nighttime Economy. Now here, the West End's colour bar was in full swing, and so shebeens were very popular for young black people down here as well. By the 70s and the 80s, criminalisation of black people was very established, and in pre-Brixton uprising era, one section was referred to as the frontline. Now, depending on who you spoke to at this time, this frontline could mean anything from a place where people could just hang out and chill, to a haven of criminal activity such as selling drugs, fencing stolen goods, and even spreading radical revolutionary politics. One thing that both the police and the young people in the area did agree on was that it was an area of conflict between black people and the police. The front line was made up of several streets in Brixton that had previously been earmarked for demolition, but in a 1975 protest by the local people, the local authority decided to just let it disintegrate and decay, and a couple of years later, only about 20 of the 400 properties concerned in this area were considered in a state of good repair. So it was here naturally where a lot of shebeens, a lot of illegal nightclubs, a lot of parties developed. Now, as far as the authorities were concerned, these places were no good. They were a bad influence. They were full of people with too much time on their hands and criminals waiting to give those people something to do. One young person spoken to at the time said that shebeens did bring them into contact with the police, but only because of the constant raids and harassment these shebeens suffered. Now compare this to the widespread acceptance of illegal lock-ins in pubs with the presumed knowledge of the police. Oh yeah, remember when I talked about this frontline being a haven for stolen goods and drug dealing and all things bad under the sun? Well, despite all the raids that happened in this place, there wasn't actually anything much found, and this is according to the police's own records at that time. But what's interesting is that the police in the area themselves had lots of allegations and lots of rumours alluding to their corruption, and they were accused of operating protection rackets and recycling drugs. At one point, the Scotland Yard drug squad even had to raid the local police station as evidence grew about all of these things. It was also during this time that the area grew somewhat of an outsider reputation, which was attractive to young white people in particular who were on the search for a more bohemian and more alternative lifestyle. I'll mention here that pre-Second World War, Brixton was actually a lower middle class white suburb, with white flight obviously happening soon afterwards as the West Indian population grew. A longing to go back to this past, combined with the unintentional place marketing the place had because of its notoriety in the press, displaying its lovely terraced houses for everybody to see and think, those are pretty, led the local authority and others in the area to run into the arms of gentrification. Speaking of all this media notoriety, let me introduce to you a common media villain that is intrinsically linked to the criminalisation of black spaces, particularly in the modern era, the Yardie. We're in the 90s now, we're doing a whistle-stop tour for an entire century. The media was awash with this new menace on Britain's streets, threatening peace and calm and good behaviour everywhere. And this threat was the so-called Yardie. Now, Yardies were always depicted as explicitly Jamaican or Jamaican-born, posing them as a foreign threat, and using words like invasion to really drive the point home. They were linked to a range of activities like drug dealing, gun crime, just general gang activity and fun times. Now, besides this, what a Yardie was exactly was pretty vague at the time, with the media linking them to every and all black or black adjacent crime going. So to get a better idea, we'll actually need to take a detour into Jamaica's political history. Now, I promise that we won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but to start with, let's go to the 1930s and the 1940s in Jamaica. Beginnings of the two major political parties, the PNP, or the People's National Party, which was founded in 1938, and the JLP, or the Jamaica Labour Party, which was founded in 1943. During this time, Jamaica was still a crown colony with a mostly agrarian economy, and it was dealing with a range of issues from high unemployment, poverty, and a rigid class system that was based on race, determined the types of jobs people could get, and had its roots back in slavery. This combination, of course, led to protests and violent uprisings, as well as the formation of labour unions from which the PNP and the JLP emerged. Jumping forward to the 1960s, and violence in Jamaica had become more sophisticated with the implementation of garrison politics. Now, post-independence, Jamaica unfortunately still had a lot of socio-economic problems, and so ghetto neighbourhoods began to form in areas like West Kingston. Now, in these ghettos, you had groups formed and they were self-referred to as rude boys. And these groups used to get into turf wars with each other. And it was these turf wars that were exploited by the two major political parties seeking dominance. Because what they used to do is they would pick sides, and these sides would be constituencies that were territorially managed and guaranteed a voter block. And these sides, we could call them garrisons. All right, bear with me now. The general elections of 1976 and 1980 erupted into violence and many people lost their lives, declaring a state of national emergency. This began a spike of migration out of Jamaica and into Canada and the United States especially, and to the UK to a lesser extent. Now, the vast majority of people who left would have been law-abiding, but like any group of humans, you're always going to have people who are not law-abiding slip through the net. And it was also at this time that the garrisons or the gangs or whatever word you want to use began to move away from politics and more into the international drugs trade. Now, this drugs trade operated in places like Canada, the US, and the UK, among other places. And some of these people who moved over continued their operations from their new homes. So that kind of brings us nicely back to where we got the whole concept of a Yardie from in the first place in the UK. Now, one thing that the British media focused on in particular was the violence that seemed to haunt black nightlife at that time. Looking at one 1999 report, for example, from The Independent, gave a detailed list of gun-related incidents in London and Birmingham, including one that happened at a Beanie Man concert. Another tragically absurd example from the same year, this time from the BBC, detailed an incident in which someone lost their life because they were shot after stepping on somebody else's toe. Both of these articles, of course, connect these incidents to Yardies and Jamaican crime. So I actually personally remember a lot of this coverage, even though I was quite young. I wasn't going clubbing in the 90s. But even edging into the 2000s, you know, when you're a teenager, you want to go out a bit more. There were places that had stigma. There were jokes, really dark jokes being told about getting shot up in the club. And I remember this one incident where it was like the first and last time I ever went to Stratford Rex, because it closed soon afterwards and it was pretty notorious. But we were all sort of ejected suddenly from this place, I assume because of a disturbance. And so as we're walking, we're not too far away from the venue itself, we suddenly hear this really loud noise behind us, and it caused all of us to sprint to Stratford bus station. Now, if you know the area, you know that Stratford bus station is actually not that close, not running distance when you don't expect it from Stratford Rex. So that was quite a bop. And when we got to the bus station, I think we figured out that it was probably a firework, but that just kind of gives you some indication of how skittish everybody was. And I think this hypervigilance shows up in the strictness of a lot of DJs and a lot of promoters who to this day will shut down an event at the slightest whiff of any trouble in a club or in a corner somewhere between two drunk dudes who aren't getting along. Although I get it, but it's genuinely often an overreaction. But it actually got to the point a few years back where I kind of stopped going out for a little while because it just felt like a waste of money. It was like every time you went out, you would have paid your money, you would have paid for your ticket, you would have got dressed up only for the night to lock off. Every time without fail. I know I wasn't the only one who felt this way, and it felt like a lot of a hassle just to go out and relax for everyone involved, for the promoters, for everybody. It was just a hard time all round. Okay, so we're looking at the new millennium now. It's the 21st century. And the criminalisation of black music began to be a little bit more explicit. Garage and hip hop collective So Solid Crew were a prime example of this criminalisation in the media. For example, One 2003 article reported a gangland shooting in Clerkenwell, described as, quote, associated with the notorious rap group Solid Crew. But only one member was there, and it was never confirmed whether she was connected to any of the people involved or if she was even there when it happened. In another example, a politician singled out the group among, quote, rap and garage groups glamorizing guns, speaking after a tragic incident in which 2 teenage girls tragically lost their lives when they were fatally shot in Birmingham. The article goes further and starts to actually look into the individual legal troubles of members. Just in case you weren't totally convinced that the So Solid Crew were a bunch of wrong-uns, the group were intensely stigmatized by the media at that time and were poster children of everything that was supposedly wrong with black urban life in the early 2000s. Now we're in the middle of the decade, and the police and the press have focused their attention on criminalising a new genre, this time grime. It's here that we level up in politician, with the then Prime Minister David Cameron himself describing the genre as encouraging people to carry guns and knives. This also brought about the formal discrimination against black nighttime activities. One notorious example is the promotion event risk assessment form 696. Launched by the Metropolitan Police in 2008, its aim was to identify and minimise any risk of most serious violent crime happening at proposed events, and included direct questions asking for the ethnicity of attendees and if R&B, bashment or garage will be played. While it was revised at one point to be a bit less obvious in its questioning, it carried on being used until 2017 and only came to an end after a Mayor of London ordered review into it. In its 9-year lifetime, it left a lasting impact on black nightlife in London. Criminalisation of black music continues to this day, this time UK drill. So with all of this, I decided to have a look for myself and see if there were any correlations between crime stats in the nighttime economy and race. I had to dig, and there wasn't anything along racial lines. But I did find some information on drinking habits and how the police felt about their time spent in the nighttime economy. A 2014 study reported that 30% of white British men and 15% of white British women drank at hazardous, harmful or dependent levels. For some perspective, this was about 12 million people at the time. This is in comparison with 143,000 black men and women with the same hazardous drinking levels. Now, to give you some context, the estimated total UK population was just under 60 million at the time. As far as policing is concerned, in a 2015-16 study, 28 constabularies said that their busiest times were during the weekend peak when everyone is out on the town, and felt that alcohol was the main driver behind this peak. Once again, I admit, couldn't find any stats along race explicitly affecting the nighttime economy policing levels, so there is a bit of conflation here. But given the above and combining it with the things that we see with our own eyes when we watch TV or when we go to any town centre, you would be forgiven for thinking that white majority events would be heavily policed. However, with these same eyes, we see time and time again instead that there is an attitude of tolerance and lenience directed at disorder committed by white people. And also we see double standards, such as the fact that Glastonbury, for example, and Notting Hill apparently have pretty similar rates of arrests. Now, I'm going to move on to something I haven't mentioned yet, which is the impact of gentrification. Any major city district which has a reputation for crime and deprivation will be an area ripe for being put on the regeneration queue. However, before we get into that, we need to take a look at the attitudes that surround regeneration, how it ties with the nighttime economy, and how that collides with black nightlife. It's complicated, so let's begin with licensing. Yay, licensing! There's always been a balancing act between the benefits of selling alcohol and making money off alcohol versus the social disease that consuming it represents. While alcohol laws in this country date back to the 1300s, and we didn't see licensing laws for venues until the 1500s, it was the 1700s where we begin seeing licensed venues as a means of disciplining clientele and controlling behaviour. And it's also around about this time that we start seeing restrictions on who could be a licensee. These restrictions were along the lines of who was considered fit and proper. As the modern concept of the police in the UK developed in the 1800s, we are now at a stage where people can effectively enforce these regulations and these restrictions. Fast forward to the 1990s. Mainstream opinion had been that the nighttime economy represented benefits for development and regeneration for adopting a more continental European, late night cafe and wine bar style culture. More sophisticated, more refined. Was that naive? Yes, it was naive. By the end of the decade, of course, opinion had worsened due to the British tendency to engage in binge drinking and public disorder, which was all over the news at the time. It was everywhere. The Licensing Act 2003, by the time it rolled around, was not particularly popular, but it obviously began its development some 5 years prior, when everything was still good. Everyone was still happy about the idea of things being open indefinitely. This act, among other things, got rid of statutory closing times, paving the way for venues to be open potentially for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It introduced temporary event notices for one-off events like a pub wanting to stay open all weekend for a special occasion or for temporary park events. And it introduced music licenses for small venues. So I know you're at home and you're thinking, what does this have to do with anything? Get to the point. I'm getting to the point. In 2005, councils became responsible for operating this function, this licensing act. The idea being that they would now be able to directly control and mold their neighbourhoods and benefit from the vitality of these neighbourhoods. Things, of course, had moved over in public perception from fretting over binge drinking culture more into looking at the benefits of live entertainment and hospitality. Now, remember what I said about a deprived urban area with a bad reputation being earmarked for gentrification? As Brixton was marked as a no-go area in the press at the time, Mission Regenerate Brixton had begun. With the increase of property prices and the commercialisation of space, class and race collided with the authorities' combined efforts of regeneration strategies, licensing, registration and policing. There were accounts of individual police having the power to unilaterally decide which venues got to stay open and which ones got to close. These police did not provide proof despite the requirement that they needed to provide proof when they were revoking or refusing applications. Also, the emphasis of the encouragement of acceptable premises and respectable licensees in contrast with the snuffing out of unacceptable premises or disrespectable licensees. And there were concerns about the subjective nature in making these distinctions, of course. So the popular Afro-Caribbean pub called the Mango in Brixton was shut down by police, citing a drugs problem even though there were no prosecutions made. Its commercial viability and the owner's business acumen were even called into question and cited as reasons for the place to close. Now, this situation with the Mango might be an almost cartoonishly stereotypical example of gentrification at play, because after it was shut down, it was passed over to the Star Bar Syndicate, which was operated by white former stockbrokers, reason being that apparently they had a business plan. If we jump back up north to Moss Side in Manchester, this was yet another area tagged for gentrification, and it was another so-called no-go area. Venues like the Reno now had stigma, and local people grew tired of the reputation of clubs being put on everyone else. So these venues were also shut down in the 90s as part of regeneration. I can keep going on and on and on, giving you examples of this happening all over England. The point here is that regeneration is intrinsically linked to the erosion, the deliberate erosion rather, of black spaces. Oh yeah, remember those temporary event notices I mentioned earlier? Well, in one particular example in Croydon, the local police licensing teams had been accused of racist practices, with the owner of the local Dice nightclub reporting that he'd been told by them to, quote, not play bashment dancehall music because of its associations with crime. This is yet another example of the pointed criminalisation specifically directed at Jamaicans in this country. Okay. So we've gone over the Shebeens, we've gone over gentrification, we've gone over criminalisation. But what is it like for black clubbers and promoters in this country? The colour bar of the 20th century is over, right? Yeah, no. There are still lots of examples of places barring or restricting access to black people as recently as this year, 2021. For example, in 2015, Cameo nightclub in Bournemouth made the news when it singled out the black men in a mixed group and denied them entry, despite them all already having paid a substantial amount of money ahead of time. In 2017, 2 black women were refused entry into District, a famous nightclub in the West End, being told that they were too dark and overweight. This incident became infamous when it was referenced in Stormzy's track First Things First. Both District and Cameo emphatically denied accusations of racism. Naturally. Organisers and promoters go through problems of their own. In a 2021 Vice article, Love at First Vibe organisers described the difficulties they face in arranging an event in a Hackney venue, despite the area having lots of black people. Recess and No Signal founder had similar issues in the borough as well. Speaking of Recess, as recently as September 2021, the month I'm writing and filming this video, took to Twitter to call out yet another venue, this time The Cause in nearby Tottenham, and announced the end of their business relationship as a result. In the same month, September's been a busy month, I guess. It's been a long month as well. Another group of organisers called out the Sipping Room in Canary Wharf because apparently the venue's manager had tried their best to make things difficult for them on the night, complaining about the music they were playing and even expressing surprise that the event was an LGBT plus event, despite being told so at the booking. It was almost as if they were implying that it couldn't be both a black event and an LGBT plus event at the same time. The venue manager even went as far as to instruct the bar staff to stop serving when people were still there. Like, they really went quite far out of their way to cut their nose off to spite their face and cause drama for them. Unfortunately, still stories like this are not rare, and there's probably going to be one when I look at my Twitter later on, because they seem to be coming in thick and fast. So, with everything I've talked about, does that mean that the party's done for black people in the UK? Of course not. Celebration and festivities are a key and unifying feature across all our various cultures, and it is a testament to our creativity and tenacity that in spite of everything, we still go out of our way to enjoy ourselves our way. When they tried to bomb us in the Blitz, we tore it up with our American guests. When Enoch Powell was crying rivers of blood at the sight of us, we were setting up sound systems to drown him out. When Suslaws had the police detaining young people, those same young people could forget it all under the warm embrace of Lovers Rock. When politicians lied to us, we annihilated them on the mic. I haven't even touched upon our comedy, our live theatre, our cinema, our music scenes, and all you need to do is take one look at our world famous carnivals to know that if there is a motive, we will find motivation. Also, I'm just putting this out into the universe. Please, please bring back house party. Not my house, it's too small. But you have a house party and I will come. If you've got this far, let me know in the comments, what have your experiences been? Does any of this feel familiar to you? If you like this video, thank you for watching. Please click the like button and check out my other videos. You may end up subscribing.